Welcome to How Not to DM. I'm your host, Derek. Thanks for joining me on my quest to interview the very best dungeon masters on this plane of existence. James Introcaso is an accomplished game designer, having contributed to 7 different official D&D books and a slew of other third-party supplements, including his current gig as lead designer for Matt Colville's MCDM Productions. He's also written a few of his own games. This means he's got valuable insights into getting into designing games, what it's like working with some of the best folks in the industry, and how you can get your foot in the door. Enjoy!
My name is James Introcaso, and I am the lead designer for MCDM Productions, which is Matt Colville's production company. And I got into role-playing games when I was 10, watching my older brother and his friends play in our parents' basement. And then I got into the sort of professional design side much later in life. I was working full-time at National Geographic channels as a television producer, writing and producing TV promos. And I started a blog and a podcast, not so dissimilar from this one. And eventually that blog caught the attention of some folks and things that I had put out on the DMs Guild and in some other marketplaces. And I started a freelance game design career, which had always kind of been a dream of mine, but, one that I wasn't sure how to make happen. It turns out if you do a lot of work for free for several years, you might get somewhere with
it. Oh, that's a good pro tip. Yeah. So how did you get into running games for people? Was it really early on when you started playing with your brother and such, or was it kind of later in your gaming career?
So it was pretty early on. So I used to watch my brother and his friends play. And I remember when they were playing 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid. And it was like, it blew my mind, right? Because as a kid, I had played a bunch of games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, like Zelda and Mario. And I always thought, like, wouldn't it be cool if you could sit down and roast a marshmallow? Or, hey, what if instead of jumping on Goombas, you punch them, right? But you didn't have those options in video games. And so to see a game where you had these options of anything you could do in real life, you could do here, plus you had magic and fighting abilities and cool armor and magic items and stuff like that, blew my mind. I was a big fan of The Hobbit as a kid and Lord of the Rings and all that good stuff. So it was a natural doorway in. And then one day, my friends were over and a bunch of my brother's friends couldn't make it to the D&D game. So his friends who were there invited us all to play with him.
Nice.
They needed a cleric, right? Like all that kind of stuff. So we played, and then my friend Rich went home and said to his dad, we just played this game at James's house. It was so cool. And his dad said, oh, I played that in college, and pulled out the Fantasy Trip, which is Steve Jackson's, might be his first or one of his first role-playing games, a fantasy role-playing game that is simpler than 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. And we played that for years. And that's the first thing that I ran. Rich ran it for us. Rich's dad ran it for us. But within a year of playing, I was also running games. It was that sort of, you're in 4th grade and in the summer, you're not old enough to have a job yet and not much is expected of you. So you're just going to each other's house all the time. Like in the summer, ride my bike over here, ride my bike to your house, come over to me. And we basically took turns running games for each other and giving each other's characters super powerful magic items and all that kind of good stuff that you do when you're playing the game as a kid and you have all the time in the world. So yeah, very early on, I was running games.
Nice. Do you ever play with your brothers now that you're older and that you're actually designing stuff? Do you have them ever help you play test, or do you guys talk about that stuff at all?
Yeah, so my brother who introduced me to it, his name is Andrew, for a while didn't play. As an adult, he sort of fell out of it. We played a couple of times together when I was still in high school, and then just recently he said, I want to try it. He's married now, and his wife wanted to try it, and so I do run a game. Various role-playing games. We played through Storm King's Thunder, and we played through Waterdeep Dragon Heist together, and then we've also played Monster of the Week. And so we've had a blast playing games together. It's him and his wife and one of our friends and my wife. So we all play together, and it's just been great, and a really great way to stay in touch, especially in the early days when it was don't go anywhere, just stay inside all the time. So that was good.
Yeah. That's so fun. Yeah, my home group is my wife, my brother, or two of my brothers, and some friends. So yeah, I love the family games.
Yeah, it's great, and it's great to be able to bond that way and to show like this really means something to me to folks. It's good.
All right, so the kind of the big question I love asking guests is the mistakes that you have made while running games. These could be very specific, or they could be big overarching problems as part of running games, and they can be old or they can be recent. So, what are some of the mistakes you've made running games for
Ooh.
people, and what do you feel like are the lessons people can take away so that they don't do the same things you've done?
Yeah. So, like I said, I started right when I was about 9 or 10, and I am 36 now. So that's a lot of mistakes, a lot of chances to make mistakes, and I feel like I've taken every one when it comes to running games. And certainly, there's things that I did as a 10-year-old that I think everybody who's running games at that age might do, like railroading the players, and sort of relying too much on. I find that particularly when I play a game like D&D, because it is safe, right? I go to the place where there are the most mechanics for me. I think this is true of many games, right? The mechanics sort of inform you how you're going to play the game, but sometimes I go there too much. So like there are a few D&D games that I think about where I went to the combat well way too many times because it was like, well, I know what's going to happen in combat, right? I feel comfortable there because the rules are broken, breaking the story down into slower than real time 6 second increments that I can say like, okay, I know what's going to happen. I know how to adapt to this, as opposed to, something that might be a little bit more focused on the story outside of combat in an engine like D&D. And
Yeah,
so being able to leave the confines of what is comfortable and realizing that the players also want to have fun, right? And like they're not gonna rely solely on you to entertain them. They are going to help you have fun and you're going to have fun with them, I think is great. And also remembering like these are your friends. They don't want to see you fail. And they're also going to forgive the things that you're doing if they're not like 100% on all the time, I think are super, super important things to learn. And like within that, that led me to saying no to things sometimes that I wish I had said yes to, right? Like I can think of a time where I had a player who still plays with me, my good friend Vegas, wanted to intimidate a sapient crystal that was taking over the body of the Raven Queen. 4th edition D&D was wild. It was great. And like the rules in the adventure didn't say that that could happen, but it makes sense, right? The crystal is sapient, it's alive, it's evil. You should be able to at least try to intimidate it. And I didn't even allow the check. And it was like all right, well, I guess I'll just attack the crystal then sort of moment. And what a bummer. What a bummer that was, because we could have had a whole dramatic moment where he's trying to, like Gandalf in front of the Balrog, you shall not passing this giant crystal. And I squandered that. So that sort of thing of being really open to things that make sense, even if they're not covered by the rules, for me, is something that I wish I had embraced earlier. The other thing that I really wish I had embraced was, I think over prepping can lead to those mistakes too, where you're like, well, I did this thing and it took me a lot of time. So we're doing this thing. And I think being able to let go, having the confidence that you'll know what to do in the moment, that you'll have brushed up your improv skills, and that you can rely on your players, right? Like my players, if they want to go off the map, right, or off the adventure, I say like, oh, you know what? I don't know what's there. Maybe you could tell me what's there, right? And then they're more willing to play because they're like, oh, cool, we can go off map as long as we're willing to help build this world and story. And so that sort of thing of like, everything needs to be hidden behind a curtain and I need to be put together and knowing what I'm doing. That leaving all of that behind is hugely helpful. And now I see people online who are like, oh, I'm so stressed getting ready to run a game or whatever. And I don't feel stressed at all because I'm like, I'm just going to hang out with my friends. It's going to be great.
yeah. It does take a lot of skill, and I feel like it's kind of a good faith transaction between your players and yourself, knowing that you have that kind of relationship and you can rely on them, right? And I think that you also mentioned like people get nervous and they're worried like if I don't have this thing prepared, then I'm gonna look bad or whatever. And so yeah, I think it does boil down to good relationships with your players and knowing that they want to have fun as much as you do, and so usually they're pretty forgiving when stuff like that happens. So yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you have any particular favorite memories of moments in game? They could have been improvised, they could have been planned, but moments that, your group still talks about because of how fun or epic or crazy they were.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I know 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons can be controversial. It has such a special place in my heart because in college I introduced a group of friends who I did theater with to Dungeons and Dragons with 4th edition, and they loved it, and we played multiple campaigns, 2 campaigns from level 1 to 30 because that's what 4th edition went to. And there I have a memory of, this was a totally unplanned thing, right? They were in a showdown, climactic moment in the campaign, and they were in this showdown in this portal in front of the Shadowfell. And the party, it was a party of 6, got split 3 and 3 because they were losing the encounter. Just a bunch of unlucky dice rolls, and I had a bunch of lucky dice rolls for the monsters, right? They were losing the encounter badly. They were split on sides of the map, and they were like, we got to get out of here. 3 of them left and left the room and left the dungeon. The other 3 went through the portal because they didn't have a way out. And that is a moment we still talk about because then for the next 2 weeks, I ran the group separately, right? Like the Shadowfell group, and then we're going to run the material playing group. And so that was a thing that happened that I still think about. One of my players drew a comic book of that scene
Oh
because they were
man.
so excited and inspired by it. And I didn't know all of them super, super well because at the moment we had just done theater, but we weren't hanging out all the time. And now all 6 of those people are still friends that I game with regularly. So that for me is a huge, huge moment. The other moment is in Storm King's Thunder. There's a giant named Moog who you can meet, who you can sort of befriend in the adventure, but has the potential to become a big violent hill giant at some point. And they befriended Moog and basically the entire time kept Moog okay until at one point a player just decided Moog's a liability, we gotta kill her, and took it upon himself to do that with the rest of the party. And that's a moment we talk about because it was so shocking and surprising that happened. And then the rest of the party went and revived Moog because they didn't want that to happen. And that's a moment that it's a cool thing where somebody did something that everybody didn't want them to do, but because they were friends, they were able to talk about why it was happening above the table and then come back in the story and find a way to fix it, which was great. I didn't even need to be there for any of that to happen, really, other than to, roll hit points for Moog. And so that was great.
Very cool. Very cool. Drawing a comic book about a moment, that's how you know it's a good one. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so you've been running games for quite a while now then, since you were a lot younger. Who have been some of the biggest influences on you, on the way that you run your table and the way you kind of interact or plan or whatever it might be?
That is a great question. So, in the age of streaming and podcasting and actual plays, I feel like my GM style has grown a lot more in the last 10 years because I've been more exposed to it in the last 10 years. So, there's a lot of great people that I have worked with who I have seen run games, and that has helped me. So, Matt Colville for sure has, watching him run games, even watching his running the game series, which is great for new GMs. It's also great if you're an old GM to be like, oh, yeah, that is good. I knew that and I forgot it, and that's great advice. Or sometimes he also, puts a spin on some old hat advice, dives really deep into it, and that's great. But watching him run the chain has been really enlightening and helpful. Watching him run his 4th edition game Dusk has been really cool to see the difference in the way he runs one system versus another. I definitely get from Chris Perkins a lot. So I watched the Dice Camera Action series when that was on, and to watch a designer run an adventure that they had written in a way that wasn't, by the book true to the adventure was really mind-opening to me in a way that made me say, even the designer isn't using this adventure as a script. They're using it as a jumping off point, and they're using it as a way to pull in stuff. That was super, super helpful for me to watch. And then, I'm watching the Matt Mercers of the world. Matt Mercer, obviously, probably everybody comes in and says something about Matt Mercer here, but Celeste Konowich, who is the GM of Venture Maidens, really great storyteller. Great to see how she runs combat. I've learned a lot from her. Kat, who is on Dames and Dragons, has been really, really great to learn from. So those are two podcasts that I recommend people go and check out, because the fun those people have is immense. And then also Kat, who is from the Autonomic podcast, which uses the Burn Bright system, which is a system that she and I designed with a bunch of other designers for Roll20. Kat is an amazing storyteller, and the way that they bring everybody together and tell different stories, she's just incredible. And the way she works with her players to build that story and gives them the reins sometimes and integrates what is going on. Like, everybody should listen to Autonomic. It's a great family-friendly podcast.
All right, I'll have to check that one out. I haven't heard of Celeste either, so I made sure to write that name down.
Yeah.
Just because I'm always looking for more people to listen to and learn from. So cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Venture Maidens podcast is a good one. I'm biased because it was on our podcast network, but they had started before we got to them, and just really, really good stuff.
Welcome to Quickfire Chaos! Welcome to Quickfire Chaos. This week, James and I are going to use some randomly generated themes, settings, and goals to create our very own adventure for 5e. Okay, this is interesting. The theme is conspiracy. And the setting is modern day. So we don't have to use modern day necessarily, but it could be fun.
Yeah, I think we should. Let's do it. The dice have spoken.
They have. Next, all I need is a D10 from you. And if you don't have one, I've got one to roll.
I can definitely roll a D10 here. Okay, I have rolled a 4.
Okay, the goal is to discover a new planet. Or maybe it's the act of discovering a new planet. From the random table here. Okay, so it is a conspiracy, it's modern setting, and it's about discovering a new planet in some way. So, where do we want to start?
I mean, I think if we're in modern day, whenever there are modern day things, I am a fan of like conspiracy, modern day. Let's jump into what people know, right? The more accessible your game is, the easier it is for people to get in. Let's start like in Earth, the real world, right? That's where we're going to be. It's modern day. It's the real world. Let's go for that, because I like the idea of now you got to find a new planet for conspiracy reasons.
Right. Or maybe other people know about the planet, but that's the conspiracy, right? Who knows? Anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we're assuming that people know what they would know as a resident of our little blue dot here that we all live on. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, conspiracy. What do you think a conspiracy is for finding a new planet? I mentioned one, like maybe people know about it and other people don't, but what are some other ideas you got?
Yeah, so one place where my mind went is like there is another planet in the solar system that is habitable, right? That people have known about for a long time. Maybe like the rich muckety mucks, they know about it because they're gonna get it. They've been trashing our planet, and then they're gonna take an Elon Musk rocket over to that world, and that world is where you get all your 5e creatures, right? That's where your dragons and your flumphs and your beholders and things like that are. They're all over in this fantasy world, and maybe you could even tie like real world lore, like the Hobbit isn't actually fiction. It's like J.R.R. Tolkien was a space explorer, and this is a story he pulled from this world. But then people were like, well, if we sell it as if we edit this after action report and sell it, it will be, people will never believe that it was actually a conspiracy. It's gonna, fuel the fire of like, that's not real, that doesn't exist.
Okay, so the rich people of this planet know about another planet. This other planet mirrors the the monsters and races that we know as the monsters and races from Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, which is what we're using. Is it something about you're like workers on a spaceship and you end up there and you don't know why you're there and you've got to figure it out? Or is it like, what do you think is kind of like the story arc we want to tell here?
I like to go for epic and compelling often, and I wonder if the story arc is like, things are bad on Earth, right? It's modern day and things have gotten bad. Take your pick of bad thing that could be destroying the Earth. War, climate change, some sort of natural disaster. Maybe that super volcano in Yellowstone finally goes off or whatever.
Ooh,
maybe it's a fantasy thing, right? Like maybe something from that world has come to our world, right? Necromancy, magic, or just the encroach of magic in general has caused all sorts of problems. And so now I think people want to know, you could save humanity if you can figure out where this world is and get the resources from rich folk to be able to transport everybody. And I think part of that is like, you need to either convince or you're fighting against the rich folk. And maybe then there's also like, hey, all these people who are on this planet, like, they need to be convinced too. They have their own problems, their own dangers. It could almost be a 2-phase thing where it's like, first you got to get to the planet, boom, second movie, oh no, now you got to survive.
Yeah. And all of your technology doesn't work, and that's why you've got to rely on the classes of D&D instead, right? You figure out you've got magic, but also your guns and your GPS and your whatever else, it isn't useful here. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And it gives you a chance too to say, like, in the real world, maybe you start to uncover magic and things like that because this secret elite conspiracy is, wielding magic and stuff from this world, right? The reason your family has remained rich is because, well, they're using, spells to cure people, and now they run a pharmaceutical firm and like that sort of thing, right? Yeah. Like maybe you could really get in deep in this way.
You could. Wow. All right, I like that. So you got to figure out how to get there. Then once you get there, you've got to figure out, number one, how to get everybody else there, and number two, how to convince the people who live there that it makes the most sense and that it's for the greater good, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. You don't have anywhere else to go, and maybe, again, right, like you might get there, and if it's a medieval fantasy style world, there might be some sort of dramatic good versus evil clash where the good people are like, listen, you can stay with us, but we are getting our butts kicked in this war and we need your help, that sort of thing, where you can fight then alongside with these other folk. And maybe even, maybe when you get there, you can switch character sheets around and now you're playing people from the planet who are dealing with the outsiders, right? Like there's a lot of fun ways you could do that.
All right. Awesome. I love that. Okay. So the second half of the show is really focusing on your work as a designer and kind of how you got there and your advice and stuff for people who are looking to do that as well. So let's start off with, I know you kind of talked about it a little bit, but yeah, just a little bit more in depth about how you got into design initially and then how you got to where you are today working for MCDM.
So I was working in TV, like I had said, and this is going to sound pretty wild to everybody, but at the time, there weren't that many role-playing game podcasts. And the D&D Next playtest had just started, and I was like so hungry to hear news about it and see stuff. And I remember I had a D&D news alert that went off like maybe once a month on Google. Now I still have the same alert. It goes off 20, 30 times a day now.
Yeah.
And it is such a stark difference. And I remember saying to my wife, like, I just wish there was a show that like every week was talking about the D&D Next playtest and other D&D news that might be out there. Like supposedly they're making a movie. I don't hear anybody talking about that. And so my wife said to me, like, you know how to do that. Like, you know how to put together an audio track. You know how to edit that. Like maybe you could be the one to do that. And so I thought, all right, well, I called a bunch of my friends, including my friend Rudy, who will pop up in this story from time to time because he was a big partner on this magical mystery tour with me. And I said, like, we should do this. What do you think? And they were like, yeah, sounds cool. Like, how do we start? And so I emailed a guy named Jeff Greiner, who still runs a podcast called The Tome Show, which is like one of the longest running D&D news and interview podcasts. And I said to him, do you have any advice for me? I've been listening to you. You're like one of the only people out there doing this. And he said, well, what's your idea? And I told him, and he said, well, why don't you come do it on the Tome Show feed, which was very kind. Didn't know me from anybody else. And so I thought like, oh, this is a big opportunity. He's already got an audience built in. He's already making it work. So we recorded a bunch of episodes. We put them up on the Tome feed. Jeff gave us feedback and advice and very, very helpful. From there, I was like, I've got this built-in audience. I should have another thing that I can direct them to. And I thought, like I had said at the beginning, I always wanted to do game design. That was always a dream. I had no idea how to do it or what I was doing. So I started a blog called World Builder Blog. And I was like, I'll just point people over there and say, like, I'm making my world, my homebrew campaign world for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons whenever it comes out. And we'll go from there. And so, like, I just started building stuff, and it started narratively on the blog, right? Like, here's the map and here's the countries and here's what I think is going on in them. But then eventually I was like, well, yeah, let me try my hand at making it a background. I think that was the first mechanical thing that I tried, because that's pretty easy to see how those come together in D&D, right? You're like, you got your skills, you got either a tool proficiency or a language or two of either of those or one of both. And you got your starting equipment and you got like your traits and stuff like that. And your background feature, which is like the trickiest thing to design in a background, which is basically like, why do you eat for free in town? And so I made some of those because when the Player's Handbook came out, I was like, oh, it's cool that we have all these ones that are jobs, but we're like the fantastic ones. We're the ones where you're like, your backstory is you were a polymorphed object for 10 years and you were used as a magic sword for a long time. And then a wizard came along and turned you into something. Or whereas like you had a horrible curse or you were born prophesized for greatness or whatever, right? Like those sorts of things were missing. It was all like your job was you used to be a criminal or you were a guildsman or whatever. So being able to take those and do that was really cool. And I continued. Then I was like, well, let me try making a monster now. Let me try making a spell. And I just grew from there and made a lot of content on my blog. And then a couple of years later, the DMs Guild comes out. And Wizards of the Coast said, like, we're looking for people here. And I thought, I've already got all this content, like, ready to go. I could be one of the first people on the DMs Guild with a lot of stuff. And, maybe it's not the best, but it will be on there. And people are looking for stuff on there. And so I put stuff on there, which by today's standards of what's on the guild would fail miserably. It's like a Word document I turned into a PDF with clip art and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's so many crazy things now that people can use to make it look really good. It's nuts.
Yeah, there's even good templates on there. Like people are putting stuff on the guild to help you make good looking stuff on the guild. None of that existed. And I didn't have any editors, and those old products are still up there. They're all pay what you want, as they should be. But that helped me get some attention because people did check them out. And so from there, I had been putting my name into the hat for other things. So like I applied to work with Insider, which is EN World's 5th edition magazine that's delivered through Patreon. And I applied to work with John 4 of role-playing tips on stuff. And I got some like little gigs here and there that were paying gigs. The Adventurers League said, hey, we see you've got this stuff on the DMs Guild. Looks okay. We think we can work with you. Do you want to come write some adventures? I thought, yeah, like absolutely. This is cool. And the Adventurers League eventually led me to Chris Perkins. And Chris Perkins DM'd me one day on Twitter and said, hi, James, do you have any DMs Guild stuff that I can look at? And I sent him my Adventurers League stuff, right? Because that, like, I had worked with an editor on and I was more proud of and had learned a lot from doing those. And about a month went by and he then reached out to me again and said, like, hey, are you interested in working on this book called Waterdeep Dragon Heist? And I was. And it was great. Yeah. And so that was the first time I worked with WotC. And then I worked on 6 more books with them. And while I was doing that, like the career picked up steam and I was doing other stuff. And I met a lot of people. I went to conventions, but I also like just through doing a lot of work with WotC, met people like Joey Hake. Actually, I met Joey Hake, gave me my first job. He was the editor of Insider magazine. So I knew him already, but we got to be good friends working on Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And then he recommended me to work with a guy named Matt Mercer. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's got a little show called Critical Role that people like. Very, very esoteric. Not everybody knows it. And invited me to work on Explorer's Guide to Wildemount because they needed to get that book done quickly. And Matt was like, Joey, who do you know? And I had previously interviewed Matt for my podcast. So like there was a little bit of a connection there. And so I got to work on that, which was a super blast. And like all of that stuff just built and built and built. And whenever I saw an opportunity to throw my hat in the ring, I applied for it if it was out there, which is actually how I ended up working with MCDM.
Not because you like 4th edition. I was wondering,
Well, no, that is actually a big part of it. Is I was looking, this job posting was going around. Matt Colville was looking for freelance writers, and I knew, I'd seen some of his YouTube videos, and they said like, we're looking for people with familiarity with Matt's world, and we're looking for people who like to put a little bit of 4th edition into their 5th edition. And I was like, whoa. I don't really know a lot about Matt's world, but that second one is me. So I wrote a cover letter and resume, and I said, Matt, here's what I've worked on. I'd love to work with you. I really think your running the game videos are cool. I think Strongholds and Followers is really cool. I don't know a lot about your world, but I am going to like right now start watching it all because I think you're cool, and I've just been putting it off. Let me know. And then I didn't hear from them for months. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I didn't get it. I wasn't 100% qualified according to the job post. But I'm glad that I threw my hat in the ring. And then it was like 6 months later that I got the email that they were like, hey, we finally went through all of the submissions and we'd like to offer you a gig writing for us on Player's Guide to Capital and Kingdoms and Warfare. And flew out there and we had a big writers meeting with all the writers for Kingdoms and Warfare, came back, and Matt wrote me a note and said hey, we have this idea for a magazine too. Would you want to come be the managing editor for that? You seem like you know a lot of people and you would be good to tap writers for us for that. So I said, yeah. And then eventually that turned into an offer for a full-time job doing game design full-time. And so that was a year ago on February 1st. So I've been there a little over a year now, and it's great. I love it. Dream job.
Wow, what a journey that is. Yeah. You mentioned that you had run Waterdeep Dragon Heist for your friend and family group. You also talked about how Chris Perkins was running games differently than what he had written. And I want to know, do you find yourself doing that as well? You've written something, but do you often not ignore, but you change it in the moment instead of, what's it like running a game you've written or a module you've written?
It's very fun because you do a lot less prep, right? You're like, well, I was steeped in this for months and months and months, sometimes more than a year. You're like, I know what this is. I know what this is back and forth. Maybe I'll review a paragraph or two before we go into it. It's really fun because the other thing you get to do is whenever you write something, stuff ends up on the cutting room floor because there's word limits and there's, oh, this actually needs to tie into this other thing and we changed this other thing, so then we need to change this, right? So you get a chance to bring all that in if you were like, oh man, I really like that, we had a half-orc drinking hot cocoa in the lair of the Xanathar, right? Which is not a thing that we actually had. I'm just making that up. But you could add that in then if you wanted to. You could say, well, in my game, this still exists. So I got to do a lot of stuff like that. But then I also was able to do I was pulling stuff in left and right. I was like, oh yeah, we're doing the storyline of Xanathar, but I want to pull in Jarlaxle, right? Or I want to pull in this stuff from the Castellanters. And so to be able to do that was really cool. But then also just to be cool. We had a whole storyline where a player was my character is a baker and she's looking for her husband who has been kidnapped. And that was it. And it was well, obviously we're going to work this into the story, right? You gave me this big juicy hook. What a gift. I'm not going to squander that. And so to be able to work all of that stuff in, it was an absolute blast. Highly recommend. It is weird, I will say, to play an adventure that you have written, which I have also done. And generally you have to, it either needs to be so far away from the process that you've forgotten everything about it because you've written a bunch of other stuff now at this point, or you just have to be willing to suspend your disbelief even more. And for things like puzzles and that sort of thing, you let the other players take the reins. So I've done that several times now. And it's great because I will then, I'll be like, cool, I think I will be a character who doesn't have a lot of awareness about what is currently happening for one reason or another.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah. That's funny you mentioned you try to bring in other villain storylines. One of my previous guests, my friend Hamilton, when he ran it, he did all four villains at once. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was he
Yeah,
described it and it
Hamilton.
sounded like absolute madness, but really cool.
Yeah, yeah, right. Well, and it's like, am I really gonna leave Manshoon on the cutting room floor? No, I'm gonna put Manshoon in there. He's got clones running around Waterdeep. It's awesome, you
Yeah.
know? So yeah, you definitely gotta do that.
All right. What about your past experiences before you kind of got into it and maybe your personality too? Do you feel like have lent to you being a good game designer or being good at game design?
I think one of the things that has helped me a lot is reading and playing a lot of games, right? And like outside of D&D because you just have a better understanding and like I know that it is a time investment to learn new games, but not every game is the 3-book time investment that D&D is. Some are one page, some are, a paperback booklet, some are longer than D&D, right? It runs the gamut. But every game you learn makes the next game you learn easier. Like if you think about it, when you sit down to play your first role playing game, you don't even know what a role playing game is. You don't have any concept really for it. And so sitting down to play and you're like, oh, okay, I get this now. You don't need to get that anymore, right? You can skip every what is a role playing game section of every book from now on. So, like, instantly, your second role playing game is easier to learn, but you'll start to pick things up and say, like, okay, I recognize that this mechanic is similar to this mechanic from this game. I recognize that this game is going for this. I know that I learn games best if I start with character creation. So, I'm going to go there and read first, right? Like, all those things make it faster for you and it lets you become Neo and start to see the Matrix. Like now, when I read games, right, I read the game, but I'm also like, okay, so the idea behind this seems to be that they're rewarding this behavior in play because that's the kind of behavior they want to encourage. And the gameplay loop is, you do this thing to do this thing, and then you go here. And I'm pointing right now, which is great podcast. You'd think I would know better than that. But it's, that idea of like reading a lot really, really helps you. But also then playing a lot of games that aren't role playing games is super helpful too. Go play board games, go play sports, go play video games. All of those things can help you in your game design because those are all games and you'll start to see them and understand them. And I also think it's good to consume a lot of media. Push yourself outside your comfort zone. I love your Lord of the Rings, your Expanses, your Star Warses. But if somebody says like, "Hey, this thing is cool, you should check it out." I like to get in there and check that out because like, that could spark something. We used to talk a lot in television that like you see a lot of things that get copied over and over again. So like, I don't know if you remember the original True Detective opening sequence. We then saw mimicked everywhere this sort of idea of like silhouettes and then images within those silhouettes. And it was like, oh, I'm so tired of this technique. And I remember somebody said, I'd much rather television makers go be inspired by like a textile factory, right? Like you go to take a tour of your favorite snack food factory and you come back and you have an idea for how to make a television commercial, then being inspired by other commercials. And I think that's true in games too. Like read a lot of games so you have understanding of how the mechanics work and you know how it works. But when you're going to be inspired, go outside of games and look for stuff there.
Yeah, I like that. And you really can find inspiration from all sorts of different places too.
Mhm.
So, one of my patrons has submitted a question to ask, and this patron happens to be my friend Matthew, who ran a Wild Mount game for us this summer. So, this is very
Oh,
relevant to that.
awesome.
He wants to know what parts of the Explorer's Guide to Wild Mount you helped on specifically, and maybe what some of your favorite parts are from the book.
Oh, that's a great question. So Matt Mercer was super generous and was like, "We're writing this book together. Like, I know the world and stuff, but like when we sat down to write it, he was like, I kind of know what's going on here. Does somebody want to write about that? I kind of know what's going on here. Does somebody want to write about that?" So I got to write the Isle Cross section.
Nice. That's what we played. So, sweet.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. So yeah, so that Matt said like it was Blightshore, which Chris Lockey wrote. And so Matt was like, I know that these things are going on there, right? Like he had said, like, I know a city crashed into Isle Cross and that they had this magical technology and there might be some things in stasis. that's kind of what I know. And I was like, oh, cool. So like, can there be this? And he was like, yeah, there can be that. And I was like, so can there be like this? Yeah. And I was like, can we call the city that crashed there Aeor? And he was like, yeah, go nuts. So like, to be able to do all of that stuff was super cool. So the Isocross section is a lot of the ideas in there are from me. I also wrote the adventure Frozen Sick. That is included, that takes you to Isocross in the beginning. I wrote that adventure. I wrote a couple of the monsters, specifically the ones related to Isocross. So like the Frostworm, the Aeorian folks, that sort of thing. I wrote some of the spells, some of the Dunamancy spells I created. I think Immovable Object is one of my favorites.
So
Basically
cool.
turn anything into a movable rod.
I played a Dunamancy wizard, so yeah.
Yes!
So awesome.
Yes! Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. And we all did a lot of the story hooks. So like in the Gazetteer, there are all these hooks for like, now you're going here and doing this thing. Now you're going here. So I did that. And then I also did some of the lesser idols. So I did all of the weapons of the betrayer gods. So I did those, and I did like some of the other lesser idols that you see in the books that come down. So all of that, like I said, I think I ended up writing like 50 or 60,000 words for the project. And again, it was all with Matt's approval. And then Matt took all of that stuff and worked on it with WotC. Like, it's not mine in the sense of like, what you're reading is every word that James Introcaso wrote. Many people had a hand in making that book come to life and improving the things that I did the rough draft for, basically. Especially towards the end of Critical Role Season 2, when they're in Isocross, every second was a joy for me, because I was like, oh, I made that. You know, like, that was cool.
That does sound really cool. Yeah. It was a fun campaign. We did like high level, we started out level 14 going in and just kind of like had a fun 3-month little thing while people were taking a break. So it was awesome. Yeah, I'm sure Matthew's going to be geeking out about this too. So nice. Okay. As far as your favorite projects you've worked on so far, I'd love to hear one that's non-D&D and then one that is D&D related. Just like what you've worked on, and it could be, official content, or it could be, your dad's guide to monsters, or whatever you want to include.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, that's definitely up there. My dad's Monster Manual was a joy to work on. That's something I put out on the DMs Guild. It's my last DMs Guild Adepts project, because it's the last thing I worked on before I went full-time with MCDM. And that's literally me showing my dad pictures in the Monster Manual without any other context and asking him what he thinks the creature is. Like, what do you think its name is? What is its lore? What does it do? And then me taking that and recontextualizing that into a Monster Manual, right?
So
and so like, which there were so many things that I didn't realize, that like most of the monsters have nothing that gives them any kind of scale, right? And so like, he looked at a beholder and was like, I think this is like rolls on the ground, because there's no indication necessarily that it's flying. And I think this is like the size of a softball. And it was the first creature we were doing. And I was like, oh my God, this book is going to be amazing. Like, I can't wait to work on this. And so being able to do that with him was really inspiring. And it really taught me like that you can do anything with these games, and like, you can recontextualize stuff and have fun. And these games can really be art as well as balanced mechanical design. It was just super fun to be able to work on something with my father too, right? That holds a special place in my heart. So for the 5th edition one, I'll definitely pick that. I loved working on the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount, and I loved working on, just got to give a shout out to the Beast Heart, which is a new class that we just put out at MCDM. God, that's fun. And working on Arcadia is great, because we literally let authors pitch whatever they want. And so there are so many things in there I never would have thought of on my own, that it's just great to see these authors' visions come to life and help that be created. But as far as a non-D&D project, I gotta go with Burn Bright. I warned you that it would come up again. Burn Bright is an original science fantasy role-playing game for Roll20. It's available only through the Roll20 platform, and it utilizes maps and some of the other Roll20 features to play the game. And it was true labor of love. We worked on it for like 3 years. Totally original system that uses a fun push your luck mechanic. And the idea is, we had the Big Bang. Now the big shrink is happening, and you are the last galaxy in existence, as like existence slowly closes in and threatens to eat everything. But you've got like 100 years left, so maybe you can reverse this thing. And there's a refugee crisis as planets are eaten up and natural resources are low and land wars and, greedy corporations. You can see the greedy corporations is apparently a theme with me. And unexplored planets and ancient ruins and magic. There are no humans. You play a species that has like superpowers because of their anatomy. And you can be like sentient mechs that move on their own, but you can scoop up your friends and put them inside of you and run around. You have a group of slugs that enter corpses and puppet them, which is some of the weirdness and fun. Or you could be a swarm. You play a swarm of telepathic bugs with a hive mind and all kinds of other stuff. Cat people that are in there and big beetle people, crystal people, all kinds of good stuff that you can be. Shape-shifting people. So it's just a real joy, and the mechanics are super fun. Whenever I play it with people, it's pretty eye-opening because it's kind of a tactical game, but we also took a lot from storytelling elements. The design team was very strange because I was one of the lead designers and I had a lot of, experience with more tactical combat games like D&D. And then people who had more experience with narrative storytelling, and it came together great. It really came together in a super, super fun way. And yeah, that team was just brilliant. So that is Burn Bright, Bryte. And we can talk about why that is maybe some other time. But basically, bright means an age, an era. And it's the era of the burn because that's the phenomenon that is coming to surround you and eat your planet. It's called the burn.
Got it. I'll make sure to throw some links in the episode notes so people can go check that out. All right. Is it hard to take someone else's world, as you did with Wildemount or a few of the other books you've kind of worked on, and make it into playable material? Or is it easier as a designer because you're kind of given the sandbox in which to work, or the parameters, and then you can kind of just do what you want within that space?
The answer is yes. So for the reasons you mentioned, right, that it's easier in the sense that like when you go to create in a world that has already been made, you don't need to come up with every idea. And often ideation, especially in role-playing games and a game like D&D that uses a lot of random tables, can be difficult because you're like, whew, I'm going to think of 20 more encounters that you could have here. And if you already know what's there because somebody, Ed Greenwood has years of lore, you can just look at that and be like, oh, okay, well, it looks like there's some hags and some unicorns and some. I will say that the further back you go, the more difficult certain things become, right? It is harder for me personally to write for the Forgotten Realms than it is for me to write for Wildemount. And then like Eberron, which I also wrote for, is somewhere in between that. And it's because the Forgotten Realms has a lot of history to it, right? So it's hard to know like what is current, what is canon, what is not, right? Like, and so you can say, hey, I'm going to do this. And they'll be like, oh, that's a great idea. But you can't actually do that because of it's going to step on this. And we have a big plan for this down the road. Or we're about to do this in a video game somewhere or that kind of thing. So that can be difficult. Those parameters that can help you can also run up against quite a bit. And again, like Explorer's Guide to Wildemount, that was great because it was like, hey, I'm working with Matt. I get immediate feedback of like if it's okay to do this or not. And I was working in a part of his world where he hadn't gone yet, right? He hadn't taken anybody there. So that made it super easy. It was sort of like creating an original world, but also having the parameters to guide you, which was the best of both worlds. When you're creating from scratch whole cloth, right? Nobody else is in charge and you get to be the one to decide. And that is really having that power and that creative freedom is really fun. I would say on the whole, for me, that's easier as long as I'm not getting burnout, but it is more work, right? It's more work, especially if you have a team. You have to be the one to lead that team and field all their questions and keep that consistent, right? And say like, I did say that this is, the way sea slugs act. And so we can't have them act this way, even though that's a cool idea, because it's going to mess up this other thing over here, which is also a cool idea. And this is more important to have than that.
Yeah, that makes sense. What is it like working for the Matts? Those two are probably the most mentioned on this show as far as people who are inspirational and, people who people like to emulate or learn from. So, yeah, just like a quick little snippet about what it's like to work for both of them.
Yeah, it is a joy, and they are the people that they appear to be on camera, which is not true of everyone, right? Matt Mercer is kind and generous and creative and smart and encouraging. Like, it was just, and he could have been super mean, and I would have been like, well, I'm still lucky to get to work on a Critical Role book. And not at all. Doesn't have a malicious bone in his body, as far as I can tell, but is also like a strong creative leader and knows what he wants and a good boss. Working with him was a delight and great. And like I said, I already said about like how much creative freedom we had to work with him. Working with Matt Colville, who I think of as Matt now because every day I'm talking to Matt and about stuff we're doing, is also a joy. And it is a joy in the sense that, like, one, Matt is really smart. He is also very kind and generous. And he is pretty hands off. Like, he, not just with me, with a lot of the employees at MCDM, he'll say, I hired you to do this job. I'm going to let you do that job. Right. And like, he has his input, and he could very easily, as CEO, say, I'm going to override you here because I think this is what's important. But he'll say, like, oh, I don't agree with you here. Here's what I think, but I'm going to let you make the call because it is your job. And like, I hired you because you know about this, right? And that is a really incredible thing. Both of them know that like respect begets respect. And Matt Colville is also very available. So like, he's not a micromanager. He's very hands off. But if I have a question, if I need to talk something out, he is there and like, hey, let's do it. Let's talk it out. And he's also brimming with ideas. Every week, we're talking about a future MCDM thing we could work about. And it is just like, oh, I want to work on that right now, So just a creative powerhouse that's really brilliant and really smart and fun to work for. So it's great.
Awesome. Okay, the last few questions here are really about advice and then about where people can find your work. So let's get in first to the advice for aspiring game designers. So people who are listening who are really interested in designing, whether it be for games that already exist or creating new games, totally new original games, what are good ways for them to practice? What's the way to find opportunities? And then, yeah, just generally, what's your advice for them as they're kind of working on this journey themselves?
I think a big thing is in this day and age, if you want to write and create, you're probably not going to be asked to do it unless you've already done it, which means that when you start to do it, you have to do it for yourself. And so give yourself deadlines. That's the biggest thing. Me having a blog, right? Like, I knew that to build an audience with a blog, I had to put out content regularly, which meant that I had to have a blog post every week or whatever the schedule you decide is. But I had to have it there because people would expect it. Otherwise, they wouldn't show up every day just to see, like, did James do this or not? Like, if I have a schedule, they know, show up on Thursday, it'll be there. Show up the first Friday every month, it'll be there, whatever it is. Giving myself those deadlines meant that I would decide things were done. And I've said this before, and it's not mine, but other people have said perfect is the enemy of done, right? And especially when you're putting your first things out there, you are nervous because you feel insecure about it because you've never done it before. Better to get it out there and keep going than to keep working on the same thing over and over again. So my advice would be like, give yourself deadlines, make them reasonable, whatever is going to work for you and your schedule, and also do it in such a way that you start small, right? Because it's probably going to take you more time to make a background than you think because it's your first time doing it, right? So give yourself that time, start small. Don't start with a giant campaign world that you're going to put out and give yourself a deadline for that. Start with like, one town in that campaign world that you're going to write about and go from there. So that's really my advice is give yourself a deadline so that you are writing, practice writing, and go from there.
That's a great advice. Yeah, and I think a lot of people do get stuck where they're like, well, there's so much more I could do, so much more editing or things I could add. Whereas it's probably better to just start putting stuff out and work on the next thing and keep getting better at it. Yeah, I love that. All right, what about advice for people who are running games?
I would say give yourself enough prep that you feel comfortable, but don't be afraid to improv. And I would say start to push yourself into uncomfortable places a little bit at a time. And by that, I mean, like, if you were like me and not totally comfortable improving and making things up on the fly, think about how you normally prep and say, like, I'm going to remove this section. Like, I'm just going to bullet point this out rather than write it out in paragraphs or whatever it is. Give yourself a little bit at a time. Slowly remove those safety nets until you get to a point where you feel comfortable with, like, hey, now if the players zig when I expect them to zag, I feel cool about that. In fact, that excites me, right? Like, now when the players do something unexpected, I'm like, yes, this is why I play the game. And I wasn't always like that. And so that's my advice, is like, slowly remove your safety nets in a way that makes you feel comfortable so that eventually you're in a good place if that's what you're doing. If you're already in a place like that, then my advice to you is make sure you have fun. Right? You got to look forward to it, and you got to make sure you're having fun. So do whatever you need to do to make sure you're having fun as well.
100%. All right, James, where can people find your work? Where can people chat with you? And what new projects are coming up that you want to plug?
So I'm at James Introcaso on Twitter, JamesIntrocaso. That's where I talk about a lot of stuff. That blog is called World Builder Blog. You can check out Burn Bright at burnbright.com. Bright is spelled Bryte. You can check out all the cool stuff we're doing over at MCDM. So probably Arcadia Magazine is delivered through MCDM's Patreon, and you can buy single issues on the shop. If you search MCDM Productions, will come up. I think we're mcdmproductions.com. But you can also search for Arcadia on the store. There's links and everything there over at MCDM. Beast Heart is over there as well. Kingdoms of Warfare, which is something near and dear to my heart that I got to work on. So all of that is over there. And then as future stuff coming up, got lots of cool stuff coming up in Arcadia. We have a monster book Kickstarter that will be coming soon that people should keep an eye out. And I'm currently working on, in fact, I just finished the first draft of our next class for MCDM called The Talent. And it is a psionic class that's going to introduce a whole new psionic system to 5th edition D&D. So yeah, that'll be a lot of fun. I'm really, really looking forward to unleashing that on the world.
Cool. Yeah, I know there's tons of people out there who love Dark Sun or who love older editions where they had psionics, and it's been one of those things that everyone really wants in this one. So that sounds really fun. Okay, well, James, thanks so much for joining me. And it's been a ton of fun to chat about all the different stuff you've worked on, and to realize how many different things you've worked on that I've actually used before. But yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks for giving us some good advice about designing and about running games. And yeah, I hope to chat with you soon.
Thank you, Derek. I really appreciate you having me on. This was great.